World War II. It's really the single event that defined the 20th century, and its consequences, geopolitical, technological, even moral, they continue to shape the world we're all living in today.
They absolutely do. We've gathered a vast collection of source material for this. It details the origins, the truly devastating events, and the profound global transformation that was triggered by the conflict.
And it is a colossal undertaking. I mean, the sheer volume of information surrounding the war is just staggering.
It is how it fundamentally changed international relations. The total mobilization of resources it demanded, the unimaginable human loss. It means you can't just read a timeline. Our analysis has to be structured, really thematic.
Exactly. So our goal today is to meticulously explore this overwhelming period. We're going to distill those key insights for you, charting the course from, the instability of the interwar period right through to the dawn of the Cold War and the creation of the world order we know now.
And to start, we really need to establish the scope. The generally accepted time frame for the war runs from September 1st, 1939.
The German invasion of Poland.
Correct. All the way to September 2nd, 1945, which marked Japan's formal surrender.
But our sources suggest that just confining it to those dates, well, it risks obscuring where the conflict really came from. Historians often point to earlier starting points, these acts of aggression that just went completely unchecked.
That's a crucial point. You see, the Japanese invasion of Manchuria way back in 1931, or the Italian invasion of Abyssinia in 1935, or even the full outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937.
And these weren't isolated incidents.
Not at all. These events were critical because they established a precedent. They showed that expansionist, aggressive action would not be met with any kind of effective collective security. They were the preliminary tremors before the earthquake.
And regardless of what start date you choose, the conflict that resulted, it just stands alone in its terrifying scale. It is still the deadliest conflict in human history.
The statistics are they're almost too large to really process, but they demand our attention. The estimates for total global casualties are generally accepted to be somewhere between 70 and 85 million people dead.
70 to 85 million.
And to put that number into perspective for you, that's roughly the entire current population of a country like Germany or the United Kingdom, just completely wiped out in the space of 6 years.
And what really stands out in our source material, and this is absolutely vital to understanding the nature of the Second World War, is the civilian toll.
That is the defining feature of this war as a total war. Over 45 million of those fatalities, so more than half, were civilians.
More than half.
Yes. And they didn't just die as, collateral damage in conventional military battles. Many died in genocides and massacres, and as a direct result of deliberate policies of starvation and disease that were implemented by the occupying powers. That context, the systematic targeting of non-combatants, it underscores the unparalleled brutality and the global transformation the war initiated.
That sets a profoundly difficult but necessary baseline for our discussion. So how did the world descend into that kind of industrialized catastrophe? We have to go back to the foundation of the conflict, those unresolved tensions that were just festering after the previous global war.
The common historical consensus, and it's reflected heavily in our sources, is that the treaties designed to end the First World War, they failed, catastrophically. The peace just provided a 20-year intermission.
The political map of Europe was just radically redrawn. The old empires, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, all dissolve.
And in their place, you saw the birth of new nation-states, often based on these tenuous ethnic lines, like Yugoslavia and Poland. And the attempt to create an international body, the League of Nations, was meant to guarantee collective security.
But the League had these inherent fatal weaknesses from the very beginning.
Absolutely. It lacked universal membership. I mean, the U.S. never even joined, and Germany and Japan just walked out later. And crucially, it lacked any meaningful enforcement mechanism. It had no army. All it could do was issue weak economic sanctions or, moral condemnation. It was always destined to fail when faced with a truly determined expansionist state.
And the centerpiece of that post-WWI settlement, the Treaty of Versailles, it seems almost perfectly calibrated to breed the exact kind of nationalism that someone like Hitler would later exploit.
That's where the sources really provide a crucial insight. The treaty imposed these sweeping military and territorial restrictions. Yeah. Germany lost 13% of its home territory, all of its overseas colonies, and faced severe restrictions on its armed forces.
Right. No air force, a tiny army, no submarines.
Exactly. But the real question was the economic damage, the crippling financial reparations, the key issue, Or was it the psychological damage?
Our sources suggest that while the economic burdens certainly contributed to the hyperinflation and the instability of the 1920s, it was the psychological impact of the war guilt clause and that military humiliation that was perhaps more powerful in the long term. It fueled this revanchism.
Absolutely. The memory of the stab in the back myth, the constant resentment over the dictated peace terms, it created this fertile environment. It allowed radical political figures to promise the restoration of national pride and military glory, and that directly appealed to that deep-seated sense of injustice.
Which brings us to the sudden, aggressive rise of these expansionist ideologies in the 1920s and 30s.
You see two distinct but aligned movements. In Italy, you have Benito Mussolini seizing power between 1922 and 1925. He establishes a totalitarian fascist state based on aggressive nationalism and this dream of recreating a new Roman Empire.
And his foreign policy was entirely revisionist and expansionist from the start.
Entirely.
Yeah.
Exemplified by the invasion of Abyssinia. And then in Germany, you have Adolf Hitler becoming chancellor in 1933. He very quickly dismantles all democratic structures and assumes the role of Führer. But his agenda wasn't just about revising Versailles. It was fundamentally revolutionary and racial.
That's the critical distinction, isn't it?
It is. Hitler immediately repudiated Versailles. He accelerated a massive rearmament campaign, introduced conscription in 1935, remilitarized the Rhineland in 1936. But the driving force wasn't just getting back lost land. It was this radical, racially motivated pursuit of Lebensraum, living space, in the East.
Which required what exactly?
It required the systematic displacement and ultimately the extermination of the native populations, primarily Slavic and Jewish people. This goal meant that any war in the East was, by its very nature, going to be a war of annihilation. And that differentiated it fundamentally from German military objectives in the West.
Before Hitler's full-scale war, though, the world received multiple warnings. Yet collective action just failed again and again. It starts with Italy's aggression in Africa.
The Italian invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 perfectly illustrates the League of Nations' failure. I mean, both nations were members of the League. Yet the response was just pathetic. Weak sanctions that notably excluded oil.
The one thing that might have actually worked.
Exactly. The failure had severe repercussions. It completely delegitimized the League. And crucially, when Italy eventually conquered Ethiopia, Mussolini felt he owed Hitler nothing. He dropped any pretense of opposing German ambitions in Austria.
The sources often describe the Spanish Civil War from 36 to 39 as the true laboratory for World War II. Why was that conflict so crucial strategically?
It was vital for two main reasons: ideological alignment and tactical development. Hitler and Mussolini backed the nationalist rebels led by Franco. Italy was particularly committed. They deployed 70,000 ground troops, thousands of aviation personnel, over 700 aircraft. It was essentially a full division of their military.
And the Soviets supported the other side.
The Soviets supported the Republican side. So it became a testing ground, a proxy war. Germany and the Soviet Union used Spain to test their most advanced weapons and, more importantly, their tactical doctrines. Specifically, things like dive bombing and synchronized air-ground support, which would become the blueprint for Blitzkrieg.
And this involvement formalized the Axis powers.
It did. The Rome-Berlin Axis was established in 1936, and that was followed by the Anti-Comintern Pact with Japan. The forces that were hostile to the existing world order were now formally allied.
At the same time that Europe was fracturing, Japan's militarism was rapidly transforming the political landscape in Asia.
Japan's strategy was centered on securing resources and establishing a regional hegemony. They justified their aggression as freeing Asia from Western imperialism, but of course they just replaced it with their own brutal control.
And the Mukden incident in 1931 was the pretext.
It was a staged pretext, yes. They used it to invade Manchuria, which led to the creation of the puppet state of Manchukuo. And when the League of Nations criticized them for it, Japan simply walked out in 1933.
And the conflict escalated dramatically in 1937.
The Marco Polo Bridge incident in July 1937 was the spark. It ignited the full-scale Second Sino-Japanese War. What's noteworthy here, which the sources highlight, is the momentary internal political unity in China. The ruling Kuomintang and the Chinese Communist Party, who were bitter Civil War opponents, actually agreed to a temporary truce to form a united front against Japan.
But that unity didn't stop the speed of the Japanese advance.
No, not at all. The Japanese military rapidly captured key cities like Peking and Shanghai. The fall of the capital, Nanking, in December of 1937 led to the horrific Nanjing Massacre.
An event where the estimates of victim civilians subjected to mass rape and murder are just tragically wide.
They are, ranging from 50,000 up to 300,000. Despite heroic efforts by the Chinese military, they were forced inland. They continued the fight from the temporary capital of Chongqing, but Japan now controlled most of China's coastal and industrial heartland.
Back in Europe, the Western powers were continuing their attempts to buy peace, which culminates in the tragic climax of appeasement.
After the successful bloodless annexation of Austria, the Anschluss, in March 1938, Hitler turned his attention to Czechoslovakia's Sudetenland. That was a region bordering Germany with a large ethnic German population, and the Western response was the Munich Agreement of September 1938.
Where Britain and France agreed to just hand over the Sudetenland to Germany in exchange for Hitler's promise of no further demands.
The catastrophic misjudgment. Prime Minister Chamberlain famously declared he had secured peace in our time. But Hitler, according to his own internal documents, was actually furious. He was furious that the agreement had prevented him from seizing the entire country at once.
And he didn't wait long.
He violated the agreement within 6 months, seizing the rest of Czechoslovakia in March 1939. He split it into the German protectorate of Bohemia, Moravia, and the client state of Slovakia. This finally destroyed the last shred of credibility for appeasement, and it forced Britain and France to guarantee Polish independence.
So the final necessary precondition for Hitler's invasion of Poland was ensuring he wouldn't face a war on two fronts. This leads us to the cynical Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact.
The Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, signed in August of 1939. And this was a stunning strategic reversal. Negotiations between the Soviet Union, France, and the UK for an anti-German military alliance had collapsed, largely due to Soviet suspicions about Western commitment and Western concerns about Soviet intentions.
So Stalin decides to just opt for neutrality with Germany. What did Hitler offer him?
Beyond short-term security, the secret protocol was the real prize. This protocol defined German and Soviet spheres of influence all across Eastern Europe. It was essentially an agreement to carve up Poland, Finland, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Bessarabia, and Romania.
So for Hitler, this was the green light.
This was the green light. The pact guaranteed that any invasion of Poland would be a quick, unilateral campaign without any Russian interference. It neutralized the primary strategic risk that had destroyed Germany in the First World War.
With that political landscape set, and the two major ideological opponents now temporarily allied, the world tipped into open conflict. Let's move to that period of lightning war and expansion, 1939 to 1941.
The European War officially began on September 1st, 1939, with the invasion of Poland. The German attack utilized a full force of their new Blitzkrieg doctrine-coordinated armor breakthroughs, tactical air support, and highly mobile motorized infantry, all designed to bypass fortifications and just shatter enemy command structures.
Britain and France declare war on September 3rd after their ultimatum expires. But their actual support for Poland was minimal, to say the least. It's the period known as the Phony War.
Correct. The French initiated only a very cautious probe into the Saarland before retreating. The Western Allies focused instead on a naval blockade to try and weaken the German war economy, and that, of course, just accelerated the German U-boat campaign, the beginning of the Battle of the Atlantic.
And Poland's defense.
The Polish military defense was over within 5 weeks. But what's important is that Poland never formally surrendered. They established a government in exile and maintained a clandestine state apparatus, the Polish underground state, for the entire war.
And the Soviet Union quickly moved to secure its share of the spoils from that secret pact.
On September 17, 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east, claiming the Polish state had disintegrated. The land was divided up and annexed. Moscow then turned to Finland, demanding territorial concessions. And when the Finns refused, the Soviets invaded in November 1939, starting the Winter War.
The Winter War must have been a very humbling experience for the Red Army, despite their size advantage.
It was a disaster for Soviet prestige. They had overwhelming numerical superiority, yet the Finnish resistance was incredibly fierce. They utilized superior winter tactics, knowledge of the terrain. The Soviets achieved only modest territorial gains after 4 months of bloody fighting.
And it got them expelled from the League of Nations.
It did. And following that, by June of 1940, Soviet forces had forcibly occupied and annexed the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and parts of Romania.
Meanwhile, the German focus shifted west in the spring of 1940, demonstrating the terrifying effectiveness of blitzkrieg in action.
The German advance was shockingly fast. April 1940, they invade Denmark and Norway to secure the crucial supply of Swedish iron ore. Then, in May, the massive offensive against France began, and the Allies were prepared for a repeat of World War I, a frontal assault on the heavily fortified Maginot Line.
What, the Germans just outflanked them entirely?
They executed a masterful maneuver. They sent their main armored thrust through the dense and supposedly impenetrable Ardennes forest. This completely bypassed the bulk of Allied defenses and command structures. The speed of the German advance cut off the strongest Allied forces, the British Expeditionary Force, and the best French armies in Belgium and northern France.
Which led to the iconic evacuation at Dunkirk.
By early June, yes, over 330,000 Allied troops were successfully evacuated from the continent. It was a massive logistical feat, but they were forced to abandon almost all of their heavy equipment. France was doomed. Paris fell on June 14th.
And France signed an armistice.
It did, which resulted in the German and Italian occupation zones and the collaborationist, but technically neutral, Vichy regime in the south.
So Britain now stood completely alone, facing the full might of the Nazi war machine, which brought the world to the Battle of Britain.
This was Germany's first major failure and a real turning point for the West. Starting in July 1940, the Luftwaffe launched its air campaign. They were trying to destroy the RAF fighter command to clear the way for a seaborne invasion. But the British employed a highly advanced integrated system.
The doubting system.
The doubting system, exactly. It used coastal radar, ground observation, and central command to efficiently vector their limited fighter squadrons to intercept German raiders.
Our sources suggest German tactical errors were just as important as British innovation.
Absolutely. Initially, the Germans were targeting British airfields and radar sites very effectively. But when the RAF mounted a small bombing raid on Berlin, a furious Hitler diverted the Luftwaffe to focus on terror bombing British cities. That was the start of the Blitz.
And a huge strategic mistake.
A massive one. It relieved the pressure on the crucial RAF airfields, allowing fighter command to recover and ultimately win the battle for air superiority. And that forced the indefinite postponement of the invasion of Britain.
While that was happening, Italy's ambitions in the Mediterranean were proving to be far beyond their actual military capability.
The early Italian war efforts were plagued by setbacks. Their attempts to push into Egypt were repulsed. Their invasion of Greece in October 1940 quickly stalled.
No.
They needed massive German assistance.
And these failures were strategically significant.
Very, because they diverted German attention and, more importantly, resources away from the planned invasion of the Soviet Union.
The German response was, as usual, brutal and rapid.
In April 1941, Germany launched simultaneous invasions of Yugoslavia and Greece. They forced their rapid surrender, secured their southern flank, and captured critical air bases. This conquest of the Balkans was then concluded with the extremely costly, but ultimately successful, airborne invasion of Crete in May 1941. These diversions, however, cost Hitler crucial weeks ahead of his primary offensive.
And during this period, the United States, still technically neutral, was becoming the arsenal of democracy.
The U.S. significantly ramped up its support for the Allies. Initial amendments to the Neutrality Act allowed for cash and carry purchases, meaning Britain could pay cash and transport arms itself. But the critical moment was the Lend-Lease Act of 1941, which allowed the U.S. to supply vast quantities of war materials without requiring immediate payment.
Exactly. To Britain, and most critically, later to the Soviet Union. It was a very clear sign of where U.S. sympathies lay.
All of these preliminary operations, though, only delayed Hitler's ultimate ideological goal, Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. On June 22, 1941, Germany, supported by its Axis allies, Romania, Italy, Finland, Hungary, launched the largest land invasion in history.
Wow.
As we discussed, Hitler's objectives were radical and intertwined. Military victory, the elimination of communism, securing resources, and clearing land for Lebensraum. It was a war of extermination from day one.
The initial success was staggering, using 3 massive army groups to strike toward Leningrad, Moscow, and Kiev.
The initial phase was devastatingly effective. The Soviets were caught completely by surprise, despite numerous warnings, and they suffered immense losses. The Axis forces made huge territorial gains, encircling and destroying entire Soviet armies. One massive victory saw 4 Soviet armies eliminated in the Kiev offensive alone. By autumn, German forces were within striking distance of Moscow.
So why did that relentless advance finally stall?
Several factors converged. First, the logistical difficulties were just crippling. The supply lines stretched back thousands of miles across poor Soviet infrastructure, often relying on captured railway gauge that had to be converted. Second, by early December, the severe Russian winter hit. It froze unequipped German troops and unlubricated engines.
And Soviet resistance hardened.
It did. And crucially, Fresh Soviet reserves, which had been transferred from Siberia after intelligence confirmed Japan would not attack the Far East, were committed to the defense of Moscow.
The Blitzkrieg phase had failed.
The strategic goal to eliminate the Soviet Union as a fighting force before winter was not met. The war transitioned instantly from a swift, tactical campaign to a brutal, protracted global war of attrition. And that change was cemented by events happening thousands of miles away in the Pacific.
Right, the simultaneous outbreaks in the Pacific in December 1941. This is what fundamentally globalized the conflict and brought the United States fully into the fight.
The context here is absolutely key. Japan had been aggressively expanding, which culminated in their occupation of southern Indochina in July 1941. This directly threatened British and Dutch colonies rich in oil and rubber.
And in response, the U.S. imposed a total oil embargo and froze all Japanese assets.
For Japan, which was completely dependent on imported oil, this wasn't just seen as a sanction. It was viewed as a direct challenge that required a military response, an unspoken declaration of war.
So they calculated their only option was a preemptive strike.
Precisely, to neutralize the U.S. Pacific Fleet. That would allow them a 6-month window to seize all the necessary resource territories, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, the Philippines, and establish a massive defensive perimeter.
The execution of this strategy on December 7, 1941 was a masterstroke of coordination, even if it was strategically flawed in the long run.
Near simultaneous attacks were launched all across the Pacific. The bombing of Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, the symbol of U.S. naval power, and parallel attacks on the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, Malaya, and Hong Kong.
And the U.S. and U.K. declared war on Japan immediately.
They did. And within days, Germany, honoring the Tripartite Pact, declared war on the United States, citing alleged American attacks on U-boats. The Axis was fully aligned, and the war was now truly worldwide.
With the U.S. in the war, the Allied powers quickly had to formalize their strategic alliance and their goals. What were the initial priorities?
The first major step was the declaration by United Nations in January 1942. It was signed by the Big Four, the U.S., UK, USSR, and China, and 22 others, and it bound them not to sign a separate peace with the Axis. That unity was essential, but the strategy was intensely debated.
We see a major strategic split here, largely dictated by geography and immediate necessity.
The central debate was about the second front. The Allies all agreed on Germany first, meaning Hitler was the primary enemy to be defeated before Japan. But the Americans favored a direct cross-channel invasion of France as soon as possible. They believed in massive, decisive engagements.
Whereas the British, remembering the carnage of World War I, favored a different approach.
They favored peripheral operations. The idea was to wear down German strength through North Africa and the Mediterranean, supported by heavy strategic bombing.
And initially, the British strategy prevailed. An immediate cross-channel attack was just deemed too risky in 1942.
That's right. The strategic path was really set at the major conferences. The Casablanca Conference in early 43 established the political demand for the unconditional surrender of the Axis and agreed to invade Sicily to secure the Mediterranean. Later, at the Tehran Conference in November 43, they finalized the commitment to launch the invasion of France in 1944, Operation Overlord, and Stalin promised Soviet entry into the war against Japan within 3 months of Germany's defeat.
Meanwhile, in the Pacific, Japan's initial wave of conquest in early 1942 was incredibly rapid, but the tide began to turn surprisingly quickly, really due to naval power.
Japan swept through Southeast Asia. They captured Burma, Malaya, Singapore, the resource-rich Dutch East Indies. But this rapid expansion also left them severely overextended, and that set the stage for their first strategic defeat at the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942.
Which thwarted the invasion of Port Moresby.
Exactly, which was critical to protecting the U.S.-Australian supply lines.
But the truly decisive turning point in the Pacific occurred just 1 month later at the Battle of Midway.
Midway was a catastrophic blow to the Imperial Japanese Navy. The U.S. had broken Japanese naval codes, a massive intelligence advantage, which allowed Admiral Nimitz to anticipate the attack.
And the result was devastating for Japan.
The U.S. sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers while losing only one of their own. Japan was forced onto the defensive. It effectively halted their expansion and signaled the definitive end of Japanese naval dominance in the Pacific. The theater transitioned into one of brutal island-hopping attrition.
And the ground war of attrition began immediately after at Guadalcanal.
The battle for Guadalcanal, from late 42 into early 43, was just hellish. It was the first major Allied land offensives against the Japanese, focused on securing an airfield in the Solomon Islands. The fighting was prolonged and vicious. It reflected the fanatical resistance and refusal to surrender that was characteristic of the Japanese military.
And the Japanese defeat there was significant.
It forced their retreat from the Southern Solomons and, more importantly, it proved that the U.S. could successfully drive the Japanese out of heavily fortified positions.
While the Pacific struggle was moving from these huge naval engagements to island attrition, the crucial theater of the war, the Eastern Front, was heading toward a monumental showdown that would determine the fate of Europe.
Having failed to take Moscow in 41, Germany launched its main summer offensive in 1942, codenamed Operation Blue. The objective shifted south. They were aiming to seize the vital Caucasus oil fields, essential for the German war economy, and to control the Volga River, the vital artery of Soviet supply at the city of Stalingrad.
The sources highlight that Hitler became dangerously obsessed with the city of Stalingrad itself, maybe more for its symbolic value than its strategic necessity.
That obsession was a massive tactical error. The Battle of Stalingrad, which lasted from August 42 to February 43, became a desperate, protracted slugfest of urban combat. The Soviets, commanded by General Vasily Zhukov, fought fanatically for every street, every building. They forced the Germans into a battle of inches, where their mobile blitzkrieg advantage was completely nullified.
And the Soviets ultimately turned the tide by launching a massive encirclement maneuver, Operation Uranus.
This was brilliant strategic thinking. While German forces were tied up in the brutal city fighting, Soviet forces struck the poorly defended flanks, which were largely held by less equipped Hungarian and Romanian armies. The resulting encirclement trapped the entire German Sixth Army, over 250,000 men.
And their ultimate defeat and surrender was a massive blow.
It was a huge military and psychological blow. It was the first time an entire German field army had been captured.
Stalingrad was the beginning of the end for German strategic superiority on the Eastern Front, but the final confirmation really came 5 months later at the Battle of Kursk.
Kursk, in July 1943, was Germany's last major strategic offensive. They threw everything they had, including the new Panther tanks and most of the remaining strategic armor reserves, at the large Soviet salient around the city of Kursk. But the Soviets, anticipating the attack through excellent intelligence, had been preparing for months.
And this preparation was legendary, deep, layered defenses that fundamentally negated the German armored advantage.
They constructed 8 massive belts of defense. We're talking millions of anti-tank mines, artillery positions, carefully placed anti-tank obstacles, sometimes up to 100 miles deep. The German forces just exhausted themselves against these deep defenses without ever achieving a breakthrough.
And Hitler canceled the operation.
After only 10 days of fighting, he canceled it, despite pleas from his field marshals. He needed to divert forces to Italy.
So this Soviet victory at Kursk was definitive.
It marked the permanent end of German strategic initiative. From that point forward, the Red Army held the initiative and began the long, massive counteroffensive that would ultimately drive the Germans all the way back to Berlin.
Outside of the Eastern Front, 1943 also saw major Allied successes in the Mediterranean and the critical containment of the U-boat threat in the Atlantic.
The North Africa campaign, which had begun with some initial British setbacks, concluded decisively. Axis forces were defeated and forced into a final pocket in Tunisia, which the Allies conquered in May 1943. And that secured the vital supply routes through the Mediterranean.
Paving the way for the invasion of Italy.
Exactly. The Allies invaded Sicily and then the Italian mainland in September 1943. That forced Italy's armistice with the Allies. However, German forces swiftly occupied the country, rescued Mussolini, and established the Gothic Line.
So it became a slow, bloody grind.
A very slow, bloody grind up the rugged Italian peninsula, which occupied significant Allied resources until the very end of the war.
And the relentless existential threat posed by German U-boats in the Atlantic was finally mitigated.
The spring of '43 saw the turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic. Allied countermeasures reached a critical mass. You had increased production of escort carriers, effective use of long-range aircraft to close the mid-Atlantic gap, and new technologies like high-frequency direction finding and improved radar and sonar. U-boat losses just became unsustainable. Admiral Dönitz had to temporarily withdraw the majority of the U-boat fleet in May 1943. Allied momentum was now accelerating on every single front.
As we move into 1944, the coordinated pressure that was agreed upon at Tehran really came to bear, leading inevitably toward the final collapse of the Axis powers.
1944 was the year of convergence. The Western Allies finally delivered on the promise of the Second Front on June 6, 1944, with the Normandy landings, D-Day. This was the most complex amphibious landing in history, It opened a major Western front and forced Germany to divert troops and resources away from the east.
And this new front allowed the Western Allies to steadily push German forces back, culminating in the liberation of Paris on August 25th.
And crucially, this operation also involved massive deception campaigns, like Operation Bodyguard, which convinced the Germans that the actual invasion would take place at Pas-de-Calais. That delayed the movement of German reserves. The liberation of Western Europe was really a testament to the logistical superiority and air power of the Allied forces.
But the pressure applied by the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front during that same summer was perhaps even more devastating to the German military machine.
Operation Bagration, launched just a couple of weeks after D-Day, it was a massive strategic offensive in Belarus. It utilized huge numbers of troops and deep attack maneuvers, and it essentially destroyed German Army Group Center. It's often cited as the most catastrophic single military defeat suffered by Germany in the entire war.
The losses were staggering.
The loss of 30 divisions, over 400,000 casualties. The Soviets then pushed rapidly west, reaching the Vistula River by late July.
This rapid advance brings us to a crucial and very controversial political detail: the Warsaw Uprising.
And this detail highlights the profound political tension simmering just beneath the Allied surface. The non-communist Polish Home Army, which was loyal to the government in exile in London, launched a major uprising in Warsaw in August 44. They were hoping to liberate the city themselves before the Soviets arrived to establish an independent Polish administration.
But the sources confirmed that the Red Army deliberately halted its advance just across the Vistula.
They did. The Red Army passively observed for 63 days while German forces brutally crushed the uprising. It resulted in the deaths of over 200,000 Polish civilians and fighters and the near-total destruction of the city. For Stalin, this was a convenient way to eliminate the non-communist opposition leadership in Poland, which guaranteed Soviet dominance over the post-war government.
The Soviet advance in other sectors was relentless, causing the German position to completely dissolve across Eastern Europe.
The Soviet offensive into Romania and Bulgaria triggered coups in both countries, causing them to switch sides to the Allies. By September, the Soviets entered Yugoslavia, working with Josip Broz Tito's communist partisans to liberate Belgrade. The German forces were forced into a massive strategic retreat across the Balkans just to avoid total encirclement.
As 1945 began, Hitler made one final desperate gamble in the West.
The Battle of the Bulge, launched in December 1944 through the forested Ardennes, the same area where they had found such success in 1940. It was Germany's last major counteroffensive. It aimed to split the Allied lines, but despite initial surprise and success, it failed to achieve any strategic objective.
More critically, it just drained the last of the German reserve.
Exactly. The men, the fuel, the equipment, all desperately needed to defend the homeland. All gone.
The Soviet juggernaut, however, was unstoppable.
Starting in mid-January 1945, the Red Army launched a massive assault from the Vistula to the Oder River, overrunning East Prussia and advancing toward Vienna. The Allied leaders met at the Yalta Conference in February to finalize plans for the occupation of post-war Germany and confirm Soviet entry into the war against Japan. By March, Western Allies were crossing the Rhine, and American and Soviet forces finally met at the Elbe River on April 25th, sealing Germany's defeat.
The end in Europe came swiftly in the final days of April 1945.
Benito Mussolini was captured and executed by Italian partisans on April 28th. On April 30th, after the Reichstag was captured by Soviet forces, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. His designated successor signed the total and unconditional surrender in Europe, which became effective on May 8, 1945.
Yet the war in the Pacific continued, necessitating the final, devastating actions of the entire conflict.
The U.S. Army Air Forces had already shifted strategies away from precision bombing and towards massive area firebombing of Japanese cities. The intent was to destroy industrial capacity and demoralize the population. The Tokyo firebombing in March 1945 remains the deadliest conventional raid in history. It killed over 100,000 people and leveled a vast portion of the city.
Despite this level of destruction and the clear strategic defeat of the Japanese military, the Allied demand for Japan's unconditional surrender, which was formalized in the Potsdam Declaration in July 1945, was rejected.
The Japanese military leadership was deeply divided. They were hoping to negotiate a conditional surrender that might protect the emperor and avoid occupation. This impasse led directly to the decision to use atomic weapons, first against Hiroshima on August 6th, and then against Nagasaki on August 9th.
And critically, between those two bombings, the Soviet Union fulfilled its Tehran commitment.
Yes. On August 8th, the Soviets declared war on Japan, and launched a massive invasion of Japanese-held Manchuria. They overwhelmed the veteran Kwantung army within days. The combined pressure of the two atomic bombs and the sudden devastating Soviet entry, which signaled to the Japanese leadership that there was absolutely no chance of brokering a peace deal through Moscow, finally forced the decision.
Japan announced its acceptance of the surrender terms on August 15th. The formal surrender was signed aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945, officially ending the Second World War.
We have charted the path of military conflict, but the lasting importance of World War II is found in its profound global impact, beginning with the unspeakable human toll and the industrial scale of the atrocities committed.
This section demands the greatest gravity and reflection. We have to reiterate the scale. Total dead over 60 million. The sources make it agonizingly clear that the scale of suffering was just unequaled.
The Soviet Union bore the brunt of this human cost. Our source material points to approximately 27 million dead. That's 8.7 million military personnel and a staggering 19 million civilians.
19 million civilians.
19 million civilians lost to combat, massacres, starvation during the German occupation. It's estimated that roughly a quarter of the entire Soviet population was either wounded or killed. Their loss is absolutely central to the history of this war.
And running parallel to the conventional military conflict was a deliberate policy of industrialized, state-sponsored genocide carried out by Nazi Germany, the Holocaust.
The Holocaust was the systematic murder of approximately 6 million Jews, alongside 4 million other victims deemed undesirable or unworthy of life by the Nazi regime. This included Roma, disabled individuals, political opponents, and approximately 1.9 million ethnic Poles.
And the sources emphasize this wasn't just wartime brutality. It was an industrialized program of extermination.
It was. It utilized vast networks of ghettos, concentration camps, and dedicated death camps like Auschwitz and Treblinka, and mobile killing units, the Einsatzgruppen, who carried out mass shootings in the East.
The sheer scale of forced labor across German-occupied Europe is also a testament to this brutality.
12 million Europeans were abducted and forced into slave labor in German industry and agriculture. Furthermore, the treatment of Soviet prisoners of war was especially barbaric, a reflection of the racial hatred driving the war in the East. Out of 5.7 million Soviet POWs captured, 3.6 million died in German camps, often due to deliberate starvation, disease, and summary executions.
The horrors were not confined to the European theater. Japanese troops were responsible for equally devastating war crimes across Asia.
The estimates of non-combatant deaths caused by the Japanese military range from 3 million to over 10 million, with the most probable estimate somewhere near 6 million civilians. The atrocities were widespread, driven by brutal military occupation and the systematic use of forced labor. The Nanjing Massacre is a chilling example of the mass killing and mass rape committed during the initial invasion of China.
And the forced labor system under Japanese rule was incredibly extensive.
Immense. Over 18 million people were used as slave labor across the Far East. In China alone, at least 5 million civilians were used. In the Dutch East Indies, specifically Java, estimates range tragically from 4 to 10 million forced laborers used for construction and resource extraction. The mortality rates in Japanese POW camps were shocking. American POWs suffered a death rate of 37%. That's 7 times higher than those held by the Germans or Italians.
While the vast majority of the documented atrocities were committed by the Axis powers as a result of these genocidal and exterminationist policies, the sources also require us to report on serious war crimes committed by Allied forces.
We must impartially acknowledge these instances. We look first at Soviet actions, such as the Katyn massacre, where the Soviet NKVD executed 22,000 Polish officers and intellectuals in 1940. Furthermore, there are extensive documents regarding mass rapes committed by Soviet soldiers in occupied territories, particularly in Germany. Historians estimate the number of German women and girls raped reached as high as 2 million during the final invasion.
The Allied strategic bombing campaigns are also often cited, particularly the controversial firebombing of cities.
The U.S. Army Air Force bombing of 67 Japanese cities, which killed 393,000 civilians, and the raids on German cities like Dresden. They were massive in their scale and death toll. It must be noted, however, that specific customary international humanitarian law regarding aerial warfare simply did not exist at the time of these actions. That makes their legal status complex, even as their moral and human cost remains clear.
Beyond the immense human cost, World War II drove profound technological transformation. It rapidly advanced military science and initiated the technological age we live in today.
The change in land warfare was revolutionary. The tank evolved from an infantry support weapon in WWI to the primary offensive force, as we saw in Blitzkrieg. The ability to coordinate armor, air power, and radio communications demonstrated that speed and decentralized command could overwhelm static defenses.
And the naval balance of power was fundamentally redefined.
The aircraft carrier replaced the battleship as the dominant capital ship. The carrier's ability to project air power hundreds of miles beyond the fleet made it the essential element in global naval warfare, and that was proved decisively at battles like Midway and by the British success at Taranto.
The war also birthed the modern intelligence apparatus and the first wave of computing.
The intelligence war was central to Allied victory, particularly cryptanalysis. The British Ultra program, built on foundational work from the Polish Cipher Bureau on the German Enigma machine, gave the Allies unprecedented insight into German intentions. This ability to read German naval codes was absolutely critical in turning the tide in the Battle of the Atlantic. It allowed convoys to route around U-boat wolf packs and maximized U-boat losses.
And on the technological side, the scientific leaps were staggering, leading directly to the Cold War.
We saw the development of the world's first programmable electronic computers, like the Colossus used by the British at Bletchley Park for codebreaking and the ENIAC in the United States. We also saw the development of modern rockets, like the German V-2, which formed the basis for later missile technology.
Oh.
And of course, the creation of nuclear weapons through the Manhattan Project. On a much more positive note, the industrial-scale production of penicillin, which saved countless lives during and after the war.
The war concluded with the signing of the surrender, but the political and economic structure that immediately followed set the stage for the next half-century of global conflict.
The geopolitical map was violently redrawn once again. Germany lost a quarter of its 1937 territory. Silesia, Pomerania, and East Prussia were transferred to Polish and Soviet control. This triggered the forced expulsion of approximately 12 million Germans from Eastern Europe, fundamentally altering the demographic balance of the continent. The Soviets annexed the Baltic states and large chunks of Finnish and Romanian land.
And the primary institutional response to prevent future conflicts was the creation of the United Nations.
The UN was established to foster international cooperation, replacing the failed League of Nations. Its structure was based on the recognition of great power reality. The five major victorious powers, China, France, the Soviet Union, the UK, and the US, became the permanent members of the Security Council, granting them veto power. However, the alliance that won the war deteriorated almost instantly.
This rapid collapse established the foundation for the Cold War.
The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the sole rival superpowers, defined by antagonistic ideologies and competing global interests. Europe was instantly divided into Western and Soviet spheres of influence. The Soviets installed communist-led regimes in their satellite states, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and so on. This split was formalized by the creation of rival military alliances, NATO in the West and the Warsaw Pact in the East.
Economically, the United States emerged entirely dominant, which proved essential for the recovery of Western Europe.
The U.S. held the vast majority of global gold reserves and dominated global GDP. The Marshall Plan, implemented from 1948 to 51, provided crucial funds and technical assistance for European recovery. It accelerated the German economic miracle in the West. Conversely, the Soviets seized and transferred German industrial plants as reparations and imposed economically punishing arrangements on their satellite states, creating a stark economic divergence.
The shift in global power also had massive consequences for Europe's colonial empires.
Europe's diminished influence, both financially and militarily, directly triggered the rapid process of decolonization across Africa and Asia. The old imperial order was simply unsustainable. In Asia specifically, former Japanese-ruled Korea was divided along the 38th parallel between the Soviet North and the U.S. South, a division that quickly led to the Korean War. The Chinese Civil War also resumed, resulting in the victory of the Communists and the establishment of the People's Republic of China on the mainland, while the nationalists retreated to Taiwan.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today, exploring the foundational failures of the Treaty of Versailles, charting the horrors of the fighting and the genocide, and mapping the profound and rapid shift in political, economic, and technological structures that defined the second half of the 20th century.
The sheer scope of this transformation, coupled with the profound human tragedy, the loss of 70 to 85 million lives, is why World War II remains the most defining event in modern global history.
Given that the stated goal of the newly formed United Nations was to prevent future conflicts, and considering the immediate onset of the half-century-long Cold War, we should leave you with this final provocative thought. How effectively did the post-WWII institutions truly manage to contain the rivalry between those permanent Security Council members? Did the initial post-war division only succeed in shifting large-scale conflict into proxy wars worldwide? And what, in your view, remains the lasting structural effect of that initial global division today?
Those are the questions that continue to dictate our modern diplomatic realities.
Thanks for listening.